My name is Sunny Kim. I am the program manager for UC Santa Barbara's ABA program through the Professional and Continuing Education Department. And today we have the lovely opportunity to have Dr. Katarina Ford do a wrap up of our mental health webinar series. So I will let you introduce yourself, Katarina, and we can get started.
So I don't know if either of you have attended a previous webinar. We had one for students and one for faculty and staff. But like all of the PACE program instructors that led the previous two webinars, I attended UCSB as a student. I think I might be the only one out of the five of us who got their BA, MA, and PhD at UCSB. So kind of in this unique position where I was in school for quite a while at UCSB, and then now I'm lecturing at UCSB, both on campus and for the online ABA program. So that I'm hoping between all those experiences that I can maybe help kind of bridge the gap or facilitate discussion, between students and staff and faculty, or just about how we do this between, different parties, and thinking about how we can help each other with managing stress and maintaining wellness. And, one thing that I don't know who was affected by this, so far in this group, but I think a lot of misunderstandings or difficulties communicating between students and staff and faculty were particularly evident or frequent during the UAW strike this past fall, with TAs being on strike, and there's just a lot of confusion. People didn't really know what was happening, or what would happen at the end of the quarter. Everyone's stress level was through the roof, and I think it was really hard for students to understand how much of an impact it was having on faculty and vice versa. So fortunately, I think at this point in time, maybe kind of mid-quarter, hopefully stress levels aren't too high and it's easy enough to talk about, but there's still lots of stressors that just occur in our everyday lives and tend to increase even at certain times each quarter or during the year. So selfishly, I'm hoping that this webinar yields some good ideas for how I can be less stressed as a newer lecturer, and also how I can help students manage and prevent stress, and that they can, have those tools and resources available too. As I said before, this particular webinar, the goal is really to focus more on working together as a university community to manage stress. But we're going to start doing a quick overview of the content from the first two webinars to fill in the gaps for anyone who didn't get to attend. I know that I don't think anyone would have necessarily been able to attend both. Some of you may have not have attended any of them. So just going over what was shared, and especially looking at some of these key strategies for managing stress. After that, I'll go through some slides describing those specific, stress management strategies, which will help prepare you for kind of breakout room discussions, or maybe just a smaller group discussion. And I have a list of questions I've posted that, we'll see how far I get during that shorter period of time, and then coming together and discussing as a group. And the first webinar was looking at self-management of stressors, which is kind of the main goal of all of the webinars. It was presented by Alexa Brand and Savannah Phelan. They talked about how we can overcome impulsivity and increase self-control by creating more successful contingencies using self-management. So when we talk about impulsivity, they showed a video of the marshmallow test, and you can see a picture there where kids are basically given a marshmallow and told they will earn additional marshmallows the longer they can wait before eating it. So that's really hard for young kids, and it gets a little easier as we get older, right? We probably can wait, or we don't automatically eat the marshmallow every time it's in front of us. But even as adults, we're not immune to marshmallows or any other kind of temptation or chance to be more impulsive. And they talked about, okay, why is this? Well, some consequences, whether they're good or bad, are so delayed. So, for example, it's difficult to assess how important one night of studying is when the final is weeks away, especially if your friends are doing something fun right now. Or maybe it's the faculty or staff member conveniently forgetting just how short spring break is, and it's hard to stay disciplined in preparing for the new quarter because there were other fun or even more just time-sensitive things to take care of. But eventually, we do see the delayed consequences of our actions, and this can cause our stress to kind of go through the roof. So what do we do to combat impulsivity and build more self-control? We have these 3 steps. First, identifying and tracking stressors. Journaling is a good way to do this, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The second step is identifying existing contingencies contributing to stress. So if that language isn't familiar, a contingency is basically the relationship between a behavior and things that occur in the environment that make that behavior more or less likely to occur in the future. But the behavior and outcome have to occur closely together in time to really have that effect. So when we're talking about identifying contingencies that contribute to stress, we're really thinking about behaviors we use that help us feel better in the moment, or maybe help us kind of escape or avoid that feeling of stress. But ultimately, these things tend to increase our stress level over time. You might think of something like procrastinating, putting off a hard conversation, or tasks that are difficult and make us feel more stressed. Maybe you're like me, you put something on your phone calendar and you're like, oh, I'll put it till tomorrow. Oh, I'll put it to next week, right? It just keeps getting pushed off. Students might avoid going to office hours because they don't want to have to, talk to the professor about how far they've fallen behind, or it's difficult to explain the situation that's been going on. Or maybe there's other students there asking questions for an upcoming exam and they realize, they haven't studied as much as these other students. I think especially for faculty or staff members, maybe avoiding checking your email for periods of time because the emails never seem to stop coming. And that's something I've noticed myself doing a little bit more often lately. One benefit is it does help me to have these windows of time to concentrate. But I think really why I like to do it is that I can avoid having to think about how to respond to those emails or have one more thing on my to-do list. And when I do answer them all, it's kind of a short-lived reinforcer of having no new messages because I know more will come. But there's also consequences if there's time-sensitive emails that I don't answer. So in the time that it took me to describe step 2, you probably identified some existing contingencies in your own life that maybe temporarily decrease stress, if at all. So that brings us to step 3, developing new contingencies. On busy days, want to schedule break times to do things like maybe watching videos or checking social media. I know some students do that during class, but if it's scheduled outside of class time, then you probably can, overall, you won't have to spend as much time studying outside of class because you pay attention during class, and it kind of balances out. You may need to schedule break times to do things like, even check text messages or get outside while it's sunny, even just use the bathroom. I have a grad student friend who has back-to-back sections for 6 hours on Thursdays. And she said, students come in early and there's really no break. That's pretty crazy to do the same thing 3 times in a row with no breaks. Personally, I try to schedule 5 minutes for foam rolling before lectures. And mostly I do it to help with any neck or back pain that may have come from sitting at a desk. But that's also something that really helps my stress. So that's the kind of thing that I would try to schedule if I can during a break time. But also kind of the main point in this webinar was that we can use self-management to set goals and reward progress. So we'll talk about that more after we look at a quick overview of webinar 2, as well as discussing grounding skills, which are useful for managing general stressors, as well as stress stemming from trauma. And a lot of those things can also be done during these short scheduled break times. I know one other tip from the first webinar was set a timer, because it's funny how quickly, say 10 minutes will go if you're just watching funny videos or something compared to 10 minutes where you're waiting in line or something like that. So setting a timer may help you keep accountable if it's not already set in your schedule of how long you have for that break. For webinar 2, we were looking at managing stressors and trauma. So this was presented by Drs. Lindsay Glugach and Stephanie St. Joseph. This webinar also began with an overview about identifying stress and stressors, including a list of emotional and physical symptoms. So emotional symptoms were things like depression and anxiety, difficulties concentrating, generally functioning, changes in behavior like being more frustrated than usual or more kind of quiet and reclusive. Physical symptoms are things like having low energy, getting headaches and stomach aches, trouble sleeping, maybe chest pains, getting sick more often, even maybe being a little shaky and sweaty, like having shaky, sweaty palms. A personal example of mine that's kind of not very fun, but the fall quarter was my second quarter of teaching, period. I had 3 classes I'd never taught before, so it was already pretty stressful. And then around mid-quarter, hearing about this TA strike, I noticed I started getting a gag reflex when I was brushing my teeth in the morning. So not something I was really used to. And then I connected, oh, I've been experiencing this stress, and one of the physical symptoms was anxiety, or I guess the emotional symptom, but then didn't really pay too much attention to that until I had this other physical symptom associated with it. We also learned that stressors come from many sources, like pressures from a boss or a rigorous class, conflicts with significant others, close friends, changes in circumstances, or maybe even just self-imposed pressures to get straight A's or to produce exceptional work, which might entail being a little bit of a workaholic. So what do we do about stress? In addition to the strategies mentioned in webinar 1, we can manage stressors using acceptance and commitment therapy, or I think of it as ACT, but I've also heard it called ACT. So ACT promotes psychological flexibility using acceptance and mindfulness strategies, so that's the A, and commitment with behavior change strategies. So we'll go over the 6 key domains or components of ACT when we look at specific strategies. And last but not least, in webinar 2, we learned a lot about trauma, which can be defined as kind of extreme or more chronic stress that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. We also learned about the origins of trauma and symptoms experienced. And many of these are similar to those experienced in response to stress, but when it's also in response to trauma, those same symptoms can go to the point of being more unmanageable. Maybe it's just the same type of symptom like having headaches or sleep, but much more greatly affected. Other symptoms that aren't observed as often with stress that doesn't stem from trauma would be things like being easily startled or experiencing outbursts of anger or mood swings, feeling sort of detached from people or activities you usually enjoy, difficulty trusting others, having self-blame or guilt and shame. So thinking about a lot of these types of symptoms, I can see how students that are experiencing stress, when it is due to trauma, this creates a lot of barriers probably in their ability to communicate that with me. We also learned that the reinforcing value of escape from stimuli associated with trauma that might be encountered in academic settings can really mask or overshadow other stimuli in the environment, which are basically the things that students need to learn. So this really disrupts their learning and functioning. So again, what do we do, or what can we do in response to trauma? So we learned about trauma-informed care. There's these 4 R's, which are realizing the widespread impact of trauma and paths for recovery, recognizing signs and symptoms of trauma in others, responding by fully integrating that knowledge we have about trauma in whatever way we can. So if we have some role in policy or maybe just procedures and practice, whatever we're doing as students or faculty or staff, and resisting re-traumatization of those who have experienced trauma by using these 4 core commitments. And I'll go over those in our specific strategies section. That was just a quick overview of the first 2 webinars. And then now we're going to look at these strategies. There's 5 strategies here. The first few questions for kind of breakout rooms or just our group discussion are related to these. So the first one is journaling. We talked about how it can be used to track or log stressors, as well as the emotional and physical responses experienced. So really just kind of, maybe you think of journaling as keeping a diary or writing a lot of information about something. You could also just think of it as logging data on your stressors and what happens when those stressors occur. In terms of identifying existing contingencies, you can also track your frequency and use of different coping skills, like we talked about, maybe procrastinating or avoiding certain tasks or events, and your emotional and physical responses after using those coping skills, right? Do you feel better temporarily, but then worse an hour later, or what exactly is going on? And there was this note about making sure you exhibit self-compassion and gratitude and notice judgment that arises. So when we talk about these things as coping skills, maybe you feel kind of guilty or like, oh, I know I shouldn't do that, but it's serving some purpose, right? It's probably helping you feel better in some way. So it's not something to get upset about or like feel down about, but rather a way to just be more aware of what you are using and what's working or not. You might also have a coping skill that you put in your journal that actually is a good one, and you notice, oh, this actually works better than the other ones. But whatever data you have, you can use to create a self-management plan, which is our strategy 2. We want to set attainable incremental goals with meaningful reinforcers to increase desired behaviors. So attainable and incremental. If it's not realistic, you're not setting yourself up for success. I would love to be much faster in preparing my lectures so they're ready weeks in advance. This quarter, I think what's attainable is to have a goal that they're ready maybe 1 week in advance. So I have a little more time throughout the week to do things like answer emails that I tend to avoid, or prepare exams, or take care of other work tasks that come up. So maybe I have this goal to have 3 lectures ready 1 week in advance. I might also consider creating a task analysis, which is just basically a checklist of steps or different items that need to be done to make sure each lecture is complete. And I could divide those different steps between each weekday. Or perhaps I might dedicate like a 3-hour window each day for working on the lectures and doing the corresponding readings and everything. So there's lots of different ways we can do that. And then whatever contingency we set up, we want to reward our progress with a meaningful reinforcer. So it doesn't have to be anything on this list, but some things that might help you brainstorm, break activities like taking a walk or a bath, unwinding with TV or electronics, or maybe a book. Maybe you recognize you don't unwind very well when you are still getting screen time. Getting a cup of coffee or tea, especially if you maybe have you're rewarding yourself every hour while you're working on something. Enjoying time with family or friends, maybe at the end of the day. Any other kind of thing that relaxes you, helps get you away from the screen, helps you acknowledge that you met that goal, and again, setting up this more successful contingency for the things that you want to accomplish. There's also notes about just making sure to prioritize tasks in ways that work for you. So more structure may be necessary for something that's really big. A goal of just like working on it every day, even for a certain period of time, is probably not detailed enough. Maybe you need to do shorter increments of time, or reward one step at a time. And also just take time to find supports that honor, understand and validate your unique challenges. In the first webinar, they talked about things like neurodiversity, racial and ethnic diversity, socioeconomic marginalization, all things that can create unique challenges in dealing with stressors, as well as things like accessing mental health care or getting access to those resources that will help. Alexa Brand also had a note in that presentation encouraging students to reach out if they wanted to ask about specific resources in that regard. So if you didn't have a chance to do that, please go ahead and send us an email. That's one nice thing about having this giant watermark, that you know what the email is, and we can connect you with her. Third strategy, grounding skills. So these are actually part of dialectical behavior therapy, which is essentially based in cognitive behavioral therapy and focuses on managing and regulating emotions. So this strategy is particularly useful for those of us who have experienced trauma or have more intense emotional responses to stressors. But as was pointed out in webinar 1, each individual grounding technique will not work for everybody. So you may need to try a few different types to see what works best for you in helping regulate your own nervous system. There's lots of resources online. Maybe even right now, you might want to go and just Google a list to have on hand for our discussion to see other types. But these are 2 that were presented in the webinar. The first is called Tip Distress Tolerance, which is an acronym for these 4 more specific grounding strategies. First is temperature. So there's a few examples with things like a cold shower or an ice pack. If you kind of, running hot, or aggression tends to increase when we're hot. And so maybe those things help you calm down. If you're like me, I have a central nervous system disorder, and especially if my stomach is kind of upset, something like a heat pad really helps it calm down. Or maybe, laying in a restorative yoga pose with heat packs on you or something. Intense exercise. So there's some examples like something as simple as doing some jumping jacks or having a punching bag. High intensity interval training workouts really do these short periods of time with intense exercise, and then you have periods of rest or maybe just like walking in between. It's good at helping your nervous system, basically, you fighting that fight or flight tendency by working ourselves to the max for short periods of time, which based on evolutionary theory is kind of what we're really equipped to do, rather than just running for an hour, right? So you can mix up having these intervals of intense exercise. It doesn't just have to be that you intensely exercise for long periods of time. And you could even end with some of these other exercises after you do something more intense, like paced breathing. You can inhale for a count of 5, exhale for a count of 7. We have another type called box breathing that I'll mention in a moment. And paired muscle relaxation. So we kind of tense, hold, and relax muscles progressively, like maybe, shrugging your shoulders, holding that for a few seconds, and then relaxing, or making a fist, holding it for a few seconds and relaxing. A really random example of one of these from yesterday. I was visiting with a friend, and she had her 7-year-old do 2 push-ups, kind of like instead of a timeout, or instead of taking a break from her 3.5-year-old sister that she wasn't getting along with. So those are all the kinds of things that you might think about in terms of what works best for you. And co-regulation, the idea, normally we see this more with like parents and children. If you have a support person to help you regulate, could be a family member, friend, maybe a pet, depending on the kind of pet. You can use a calm, warm tone and slow body movements. And you could also teach and model regulation skills, like doing another grounding exercise together. So basically having a grounding skill buddy. Strategy 4, we have these 6 key domains of acceptance and commitment therapy. The present moment, it's about not dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, but focusing on how you're feeling in the present, both physically and mentally. So they had an example of box breathing, where you inhale for a count of 5, hold for 5, exhale for 5, hold again for 5. So you're going around this box and just repeat. Values, thinking about what's important to you, and what's important to put out in this world. So there's an exercise where you could write out a list of values that correspond with each domain. Dr. Glugach had examples of work in education, mentoring students with research projects, leisure and play, exercising 5 days per week. With relationships, spending more quality time with a partner, personal growth and health, practicing gratitude. And then with committed actions, taking these values you identified and goal setting based on that. So she had an example with mentoring students. A short-term goal would be a weekly advising meeting. Medium-term goal would be giving feedback on their research methods. And then the long-term goal would be support completing those research projects. Self as context, it's kind of similar to self-compassion, where we're viewing psychological and physical experiences as transient and ever-changing. Our thoughts don't define us. And there's a link to this activity that they didn't do in the webinar, but you could try it. Diffusion's sort of similar. It's a mindfulness strategy that, with the goal of recognizing what we experience psychologically more objectively, if we can say that, we can do that, rather than perceiving them as like threats or realities. So our feelings we label based on a few different factors. It doesn't necessarily mean there's impending doom, right? It's just we have a feeling. We have a thought. It's not necessarily true or important. It's just a thought. So maybe you tend to have a thought like, I'm never going to be happy. Instead, diffusion would be saying, I'm having the thought that I'm never going to be happy. Or if your mind's telling you a story, something comes up again and again, you can give it a name or label, like saying, okay, I'm thinking about the I'm never going to get all of my work done story again, right? So just reframing thoughts. And experiential acceptance, creating space for emotions, impulses, and feelings that we might otherwise suppress or avoid, so that we don't spend too much time on them or energy, overinflate them. So basically choosing to chase values or the things that we've set goals for, rather than just escaping pain, which tends to be pretty common when we're stressed. So for example, if you value your child being as independent as possible, you will likely need to challenge your child to practice some difficult skills. And this can lead to an unpleasant experience, like the child whining and you feeling guilty or thinking, I'm a bad parent. My sister has a 2-year-old right now that is definitely in the terrible twos. And these are the kinds of things she's really been thinking about a lot. And she read a book that mentioned something similar, like, okay, part of why this makes me uncomfortable is that I have this thought that makes me feel bad, in addition to trying to deal with the stress. So experiential acceptance. Can you accept the difficult experience, knowing that you are acting in service of what you most value? So maybe it'll be temporarily stressful or uncomfortable, but it's helping you meet those values and the goals you've set. The very last strategy, trauma-informed care, is not so much a stress management strategy for ourselves, but more a way of addressing others, especially students who have incurred, they've experienced trauma and they're experiencing stress related to that. So with these 4 core commitments, we want to acknowledge trauma in general, right? We know what it is and its potential impact. To ensure safety and trust, so safety is having your basic needs met, letting students know the office or lecture hall is a safe place. You're a safe person to approach. Trust, sharing something about your own life that's appropriate when meeting with a student or teaching on a topic, giving a webinar on stress and mental health, right? Sharing how it affects you or people you know. Something I like to do with students is not share too much information, but basically share that I have some health issues and that I was in the disabled students program as an undergrad student. And so that they know that I understand some of those struggles. And I've actually been able to be a resource for some students that weren't even in the program, like, hey, this might benefit you. Promoting choice and shared governance. Promoting choice, maybe an example would be, let's say a student is having a traumatic response to an assignment based on a prompt. So you can provide an alternative prompt, or maybe allow them to self-disclose if they prefer. So maybe just a little bit of a trigger warning saying, hey, if this topic makes you uncomfortable, do you want to self-disclose and share more about that? Or can I have you write about something else that won't cause you to kind of relive that trauma or experience that negative emotion? Shared governance is more about when people come together, let's say staff, faculty, and even students maybe, to shape policy or make decisions that affect an institution, such as how we respond to students who have experienced trauma. And then emphasizing skill building, so helping students and staff and faculty learning how to manage stress and building skills to move forward. So maybe not just worrying about what they need to do in school and academia or to get through that quarter, but also how to just even kind of relate with others or initiate. The first question is, what can you improve upon in managing your stress? Yeah, what are areas that you can improve on? I think for me, definitely part of it is, I even in the course of doing this presentation and maybe before that, I could recognize some current contingencies that are not working very well, like avoiding emails or things that make me feel more stressed. And I think another part of it is using a little bit more self-management. I think one of the current challenges with where I'm at in teaching is that I really don't know how long things will take me. Like, I'm teaching a class I'm actually repeating one for the first time, but it's twice a week and there's tons of slides and, I recognize some things that they didn't understand very well the first time, or I didn't have time to do. And so I really don't know how long it's going to take. So figuring out even how much time it's going to require, that's a challenge that I think being able to estimate that would be good, or really just focusing on, okay, what do I need to get through each day? And then, kind of trying to create the goal based more on, lecture by lecture or step by step. So those are 2 things I thought of off the bat.
Awesome. Someone said recognize the stress first and acknowledging the stress. I think that's absolutely one great thing about how we can improve managing our stress is recognizing that we're stressed out and then kind of like knowing how to do it. For me, like I definitely recognize when I am stressed, because then I start losing sleep. And I think just noticing some of those like physical symptoms. I know that both Lindsay and Savannah had talked about, like noticing some of those physical symptoms when we are stressed, like our body changes and stuff, like I start losing sleep. And for whatever reason, when I'm stressed, I just overwork, which is not healthy. Someone shared making a list of small steps I can take when I feel overwhelmed. Absolutely. Talking it through with a friend or family sometimes is also very helpful. I definitely agree with that. I am a writer. I have to write down everything, otherwise I forget. But writing things down definitely does help me with stress. And I know, as Savannah and Alexa talked about, journaling, that's one way of managing stress.
Of the 5 strategies that we reviewed, what are the ones that you like the most? And what are you most interested in trying?
So just kind of like a quick recap.
We had journaling, we had self-management, we had those grounding strategies like the regulating your nervous system. We looked at acceptance and commitment therapy. And the last one, again, might apply more for helping others, but just having that, trauma-informed care and those 4 core components of how you can be a little bit more responsive.
For me, someone had shared that strategy to self-management, making small goals and rewarding progress. I'm definitely all about self-management as well. All of them, journaling, yep, those are great strategies. I used to do and don't anymore. So hopefully we can go back to journaling. I know for my husband, when he's really stressed, he does journaling, and I know that has tremendously helped him with his stress as well. So
which strategies do you think will be most helpful to recommend to others? So again, maybe you could also say what your role is. Like, are you a student on campus? Are you an extension student? Are you faculty or staff? Maybe you're even thinking about like somewhere you work that's not associated with UCSB.
And if I were to take a stab at this question, I would say for me, I would probably definitely recommend self-management and journaling strategies, because I think those, at least for me and my family, that has been very helpful. I would also maybe recommend grounding. I know we had in previous webinars, we had talked about, we have to find, the appropriate grounding strategies, because not everyone, the breathing exercises are going to work. It works for Savannah, but it didn't work for Savannah, but it worked for Alexa. For Dr. Gluglatch, it worked for her, but so finding a grounding exercise that is suitable for the different people. That could be whether it's going for a walk outside, that could be breathing exercises, that could be, for me, what I do is at the end of the day, we debrief as a family and we do positive talk. So we do our positive talk. It's, oh, what did you do good today? And we have to kind of reflect on like what was a positive aspect of our day, even as stressful as our day could be. I know there's always something that happened that's a positive aspect of our day. Dr. Ford, do you have any insight?
There's some that it kind of depends on the situation, right? So if a student's saying, hey, I'm not doing well in your class, I'm probably not going to start with, oh, let's, talk about trauma you've had, or like, let's talk about these grounding exercises. But in more casual conversations, I think some of those could be more appropriate. And I think it will help me to think a little bit more from, I guess, just having a frame of reference when something comes up or I get an email about something. Sometimes it seems kind of like inappropriate, or just it's, this situation, like, I don't even know what to make of this. But just to think like, hey, with how I'm responding, is it really responsive and sensitive? I don't know what's going on. Maybe they're not going to tell me everything, but am I making sure I kind of refer them to other resources, or, making sure that they are like meeting with an undergrad advisor about different things, even if I have to be firm with my policy about not accepting something late, which means I'm not going to be able to let them, pass the course this time or something. But like I can still talk it out with them. I do think, in terms of maybe breaking down bigger assignments, maybe even suggesting some self-management goals would be a cool way to just get that idea across more generally. And what are the most common stressors that you observe in other students, staff, or faculty? And I kind of added a little sub-question, just, are there any that have increased or maybe even decreased since COVID, or, since like coming back to in-person learning?
I think for me, like observing stressors in students I teach, or, also being kind of like a faculty, would be, well, from like a faculty standpoint, right, or, staff standpoint, it's like not enough employees, I mean. And not just for myself, but I think like different departments have encountered like staff shortages. And so I think that could be an added stressor, right? If we don't have enough staff to do different job responsibilities, then you may have to incur some of the additional responsibilities, and that could be an added stressor. I think some stressors for students that I've worked with are international students where, English is a second language, and trying to navigate a course that is taught primarily in English. Putting myself in their perspective, if I were to go to a foreign country and try to take a course in a foreign language, that would be very stressful so for some of my students, I think that's been a stressor. Definitely, I think competing deadlines is another big stressor. I think that's for both faculty and staff, as well as our students. I know students have shared and complained. It's like, well, my one instructor doesn't account that I'm taking 3 other courses, and they think their class is a priority, but how do I prioritize when I'm taking 3-4 classes all at once? That could be something we need to be cognizant about. A big one for me is perfectionism. I have trouble saying no. I'm right there with you, Olga. It's really hard to say no, but sometimes we just have to say no. Dr. Ford, do you have any insight? Because again, you've shared that you've been a student at UCSB and now you're on the opposite end where you are teaching.
Yeah, I've had some interesting conversations with students, mostly undergrad, just where I don't know, like one student that came to my office hours, like every time last quarter, and would just ask like, what was it like back then? I'm like, I'm not that old, but I think there was kind of this nostalgia for like, just feeling like they missed out. Like I had almost a whole year on campus and then I was gone for a year and a half and I came back and like a lot of lab things were online. And I feel like a lot of students I know, like they just don't interact as much. I think we all experience loneliness, and half of the students in that class, when they were polled, said their main social goal was to have more friends or to be less lonely. It's like they're not first years or probably even second years mostly. They're mostly third years and fourth years. And their main social goal after having been at UCSB for multiple years is to make more friends. So I think part of it's like just the stress of having this interpersonal stress and not having as much social support. And I think also like some things I've noticed are just navigating things that I thought were simple, like taking an in-person exam and then a third of them had never done it, or just all these transitions. And I think like there was good things about doing online learning in terms of flexibility and providing things, but I think now it's confusing for students to know like what is acceptable to ask about in terms of like an accommodation or being flexible, and what really is a firm thing that can't be changed. And when's an appropriate time to approach the professor and when is it too late? And just I don't know, maybe some of it I just wasn't as aware of when I was a student, but I do think some of those things have gotten harder. I think maybe there's more awareness about resources and definitely more online resources, which is great. What are any existing barriers you've noticed or identified between students and staff and faculty, or maybe even between like staff and faculty, I don't know, that make it difficult to manage stress? And I put a couple options just as examples. You don't have to have it in any of these categories, but thinking about, is it difficulty communicating? Do people on either side think that the other side lacks empathy or understanding? So we talked about these common stressors, but like, is it due primarily to just seeming like you don't care, or is it there isn't good communication in place? Are we not very good at helping each other problem solve, or like, sharing those resources? So that might just inspire something related, but not answering that question, and that's totally fine. Just curious what you all think. And I guess maybe I mentioned some of these in response to the last question too, but I think definitely with communication, there's some confusion about, communicating. Or like a student came up to me yesterday and said, hey, I have some questions about some of these studies you mentioned, like who should I talk to about that? It's like, probably me. Like I created the lecture. You can come to my office hours. Like that's why they're on the syllabus. I don't know. Olga said one of the main things I noticed working with grad students is that there can be a disconnect between what grad students struggle with, being overwhelmed with, and what faculty think the students need. One example is grading. It always takes much longer for TAs than faculty anticipates. Yes, and I remember that as a TA. I think some of the classes I TA'd for, the faculty didn't really know or think much about how long it would take. But I think students sometimes got frustrated. They're like, why don't I have this yet? And be like, well, I have like 3 other things I have to do this week. And I want to give you feedback, but I don't know, there's not like a deadline or something. The friend I mentioned that has these back-to-back sections, one day she said she has 3 faculty members wanting to have a 1-hour meeting with her every week. And I even asked her, I'm like, hey, could you have them like do a half hour every week or once every other week? And her update from this last week was, yeah, I still have all those meetings. Okay, another one, struggling after the PhD. A lot of grad students find themselves incredibly overwhelmed after the program because they cannot find academic jobs and feel like there are no options left. Yes, that is one I can strongly relate to. For various reasons, took quite a while in my grad program, and I finished my dissertation in December of 2020. So it was a terrible time to graduate, and I had had to redo my dissertation proposal because it was supposed to be an in-person thing because of the pandemic. Really just was like, down to the wire. All I had time to think about was actually meeting the requirements because I had to have them done. And then afterward, it was like, oh, right. Okay. Now I want to take the VCBA exam and I'm looking for jobs. And as someone who, I have a family member that became a lawyer, but I didn't really know anyone who did the academic route or did a grad program. And so it's fun hearing from students now who have these, extended family or network of people who kind of know all these things and remind them or are helping them think about how to do it. And I think I definitely kind of waffled and was like, I don't think anyone really talked to me about this, but I should have been thinking about it. So just, yeah, it's a difficult transition time. I think our grad students are very stressed and yeah, it is tough to know. One thing I've been trying to do actually the last 2 quarters is have my TAs really track the hours that they're spending each week because it's supposed to be up to 20 hours. And I changed some things in the schedule of my syllabus this quarter. Like I made something due week 1, even though I don't like to do that because it tends to be a little chaotic, just to move things up because I realized there's too much that was stacking up at the end of the quarter. And trying to check in with my TA a little bit more about what does your quarter look like? Are you going to have a bunch of finals due on finals week because you're also going to have to grade this and you only have 4 days, before grades are due or things like that. If there's any ideas about how we can work together as a, UCSB community to improve this. So the stressors for students and grad students, staff and faculty. I don't know if it's something that you've been trying that you found that was helpful, or maybe something mentioned in the webinar that, you want to suggest to others, or collaborating, sharing resources. Love to collaborate on some of the workshops we offer. Yes, actually, that's something one of my students was talking about too. I just announced this webinar in class and oh, I had no idea these were happening. I'm like, I guess I didn't either until I was asked if I could lead one. And then there was one the library had on, looking at, was going from learner-centered to lecture-centered classes. And I thought it was fascinating. I was really sick and I couldn't go, but I think there are some really cool things. So maybe it's just even getting the word out better to different people in different departments, or I don't know exactly how those things circulate.
But I think this was a great exercise. And I think, I think it's great that the UCSB community is allowing us to have these ongoing conversations about stress and mental health, because stress, if we don't deal with stress properly, it can become this thing that really impacts us mentally, physically, and the longer we deal with stress, the longer we live with stress, it just gets worse. So I think figuring out ways, even if, UCSB is it's located on such a beautiful campus, even if it means taking a 10-minute break to step outside the office and enjoy the amazing ocean view, I think we're so fortunate to have that resource. I would encourage us to find strategies to help de-stress, and hopefully this webinar was helpful in helping you guys identify. And I think some of you guys did share, oh, I used to do this, but I don't. Hopefully that this webinar will help you say, let me try that out again, because it was helpful in the past.
And speaking of resources too, I have just this slide that are resources, too, from UCSB, but I happened to find the link for student well-being, and I realized they've really listed kind of everything that's relevant, basic needs, CAPS, care, other things like that. So that's probably a link I'll use just to refer, as well as some that were shared in the first webinar, everything kind of below those two about UCSB that again might be helpful for anyone here or just to pass on to students. So.